Paul, I think you're muted.
Okay, hello, welcome. Welcome to the day 2 of Historical Materialism Online. For those of you who are watching someone speaking at a microphone and wondering why that you couldn't hear them, that was because my mic was muted. Hopefully that's the only mistake we'll make this afternoon. This panel is Performance and Political Economy. The panel lasts 1.5 to 1 3/4 hours. We have 3 speakers. I'll introduce the speakers and then I'll talk a little bit about how you can participate. The speakers are, first, Shane Boyle, lecturer in drama at Queen Mary in London. He's recently co-edited PostDramatic Theater and Form. Jaswinder Blackwell-Pal is an associate lecturer at Birkbeck. She's recently contributed to a special issue on theatres of labour in Platform Journal, and she's best known in historical materialism for being the Historical Materialism London conference guru. Martin Young is a theatre technician who teaches drama at Anglia Ruskin University. He's an editor and contributor to the Shakespeare Bulletin on Theatrical Labour, which is shortly coming out, and he is another contributor to the new edition of Platform Journal on Theatres of Labour. The speakers will speak for 15 to 20 minutes each. We'll start with Shane on In Service to Capital. Then Jazz will talk about the organisational logic of character. And finally, Martin will talk about Backstage Labor. Then there'll be the opportunity for discussion. Discussion will be, and questions will be answered via the YouTube chat box to the right of your screen, and I'll convey the questions through to the speakers. But let's make a start, and let's start with Shane.
I think, Jazz, did you want to introduce our collective project to start?
Yeah, so just to start by saying a few words about the project that these papers have emerged from. So the 3 of us are part of a reading group on performance and political economy, alongside lots of our colleagues and comrades across London, and people have also joined in from internationally as well. We've been meeting regularly for about 2 years, and we meet about once a month to discuss various texts related to performance, theatre and political economy. And we've organised some events, including a day school in January, which allowed us to kind of do some more collective work on some of the themes and issues that have emerged from the discussions that we've been having as a group. At the moment, we're working collectively on a written project where we're putting together a series of Marxist keywords related to theatre and performance. So that's a project we're working on at the moment. If you are interested in perhaps joining our reading group or finding out more about what the Performance and Political Economy group is doing, please get in touch with us, or let us know in the chat box maybe, and we can gather your contact details and add you to our mailing list. And yeah, just a note to say that these papers have partly emerged as a result of those kind of collective conversations that we've been having with that group over the last couple of years.
Great, thank you, Jazz. So I'm Shane Boyle. The title of my talk is In Service to Capital. I'm going first because we thought that my talk will hopefully set up more what Jazz and Martin are going to be talking about with regards to the relation of performance with economics and Marxism more broadly. So my job basically today is to try to describe what has happened to theater under deindustrialization. And as it turns out, nothing much has actually happened to theater under deindustrialization. Or to be more precise, nothing much has happened to theater's economic relation to capital under deindustrialization. Theater, as it has been at least since it first became a site of capital investment in and around the 18th century in Northern Europe, remains both subject to value and not subject to value. What defines theater under capitalism is theater's potential to be organized along capitalist lines, but also by the fact that despite this potential, theater is also often not organized along capitalist lines. Theatrical production is not so much exceptional to the capitalist mode as it is sometimes, if not often, exceptional. Theater, one might say, combines the material outlays from constant capital that are used in a performance, things like the sets, the theater building, the rigging, lights, seating, and so forth, with the variable capital invested in the labor power of all manner of workers. That includes people like performers, designers, technicians, front of house staff, etc. What results from this deployment of capital is a commodity known as performance that has some vaguely defined usefulness for audiences and which some hope generates a profit for the capitalist. Meanwhile, those workers whose labor power is exploited receive a wage that they then spend on the market to purchase the goods they need to live, like, cigarettes and video games. That's a joke about actors that you would laugh at if I was not speaking into the void. There you have it, theatrical production, at least from the standpoint of capital. But of course, a capitalist theater is not the only kind of theater in town. In fact, even today, many, if not most, instances of theater are actually exceptional to capitalist commodity production. When it comes to theatrical production, counterexamples like community theaters, student theaters, amateur theaters, state-subsidized theaters, etc., are likely more the norm than the exception. This hardly means that such theaters are not grievously damaged just by the fact of their existing in a capitalist society, but only that their production processes are not necessarily capitalist. They do not directly involve the social relations associated with capitalist production. This is all to say that the theater does not possess the same sort of economic exceptionalism to capital that the likes of Dave Beach and now many others have attributed to visual art. According to Dave Beach, who speaks primarily about so-called fine visual art, artistic production tends not to conform to the rules of productive labor and value production. Painting and sculpture typically do not entail wage labor, competition, standardization, or capital investment, at least not at the point of artistic production. Now, given that many examples of theatrical production do display these exact features, however, the grounds for the economic exceptionalism of visual art as a general rule cannot be said to hold for theater. That theaters at any one time can be organized along capitalist lines or not suggests to me that we should describe theater as being contingently exceptional to capitalist production. Plenty of capitalist theaters exist alongside non-capitalist theaters within a capitalist society. That, in a nutshell, is our general theory of the economic relation between theater and capital. What I want to do now, and in the rest of this talk today, is reflect a little bit on what theater's contingent economic relation to capital might tell us about the world of work today, which, so we are told at almost every turn, has increasingly come to resemble performance. Okay. In the vast and growing scholarship on the vast and growing service sector, the performing arts play a starring role. Some, like the sociologist Arlie Hochschild, have argued that service work enlists skills that overlap with performance, like the deep acting of flight attendants. With its low wages and dismal prospects for productivity growth, theater also often appears in economics textbooks as a case study for the Balmolian cost disease that plagues the service sector as a whole. Meanwhile, business consultants love extolling the competitive advantages that companies can reap by restaging customer-facing activities into what the Harvard Business Review calls a service theater. Perhaps most famously, the contingent hiring practices that have long defined the working lives of performers are said to be the basis for today's gig economy of project-based employment. Be it as a metaphor or a model, performance has a particular capacity to illuminate the world in which the majority of workers globally now earns a wage. As Michael Hart and Antonio Negri grandly announced 20 years ago in their book Empire, today performance is put to work. and this is hard negri, every form of labor that produces an immaterial good, such as a relationship or an affect, solving problems or providing information, from sales work to financial services, is fundamentally a performance. The product is the act itself. Now, the putting to work of performance that Hart and Negri continue to claim is new is, in fact, nothing new, of course. Nor is the appeal of performance for explaining how service fits into a capitalist economy. Classical economists like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill presented the actor whose performance vanishes in the course of its unfolding as living embodied proof why a service could never store value, let alone reproduce capital. In response, marginal utility theorists, including W.S. Jevons and Alfred Marshall, contended that the very pleasure an audience draws from a theatrical performance was evidence that services were both useful and of economic value. If nothing else, centuries of debate over the economic relation of service work to capital view performance as an exemplary kind of service. Service is typically defined in the negative. It is neither agricultural nor manufacturing work. A service is consumed at or near the time of its production, and usually it does not fix itself in a tangible or physical product. The service category is said to be a big tent, gathering beneath it a wide array of activities, some as different in character as they are in the social status and compensation they attract. Well-heeled financiers and lawyers work in service, but so too do the baristas and cleaners who serve them. Today's service sector is said to span the pay spine, and it dips precipitously into informality and often underemployment. A service worker is as or more likely to be a migrant woman employed on a 0 hours contract than she is to hail from the so-called professional managerial class. Racialized and gendered unevenness has long defined service, true even in the 18th century when Adam Smith lumped together what he called the greatest and most important services, that of judges and doctors, with what he called the most frivolous, that of actors and sex workers. The service category's historical durability, however, can conceal a significant recent shift. As Jason Smith explains, what most distinguishes service work today from that of centuries past is that, and this is Jason, these new service occupations are organized as they were typically not in the 19th century, along properly capitalist lines. This is me. If most services during an earlier period of capitalist history were rendered as personal services paid for directly by their consumers, services are now increasingly invested with capital and subsumed into a capitalist production process. That is, of course, when they are not worth being transformed into consumer goods like, say, the dishwasher. Since the 1970s, it has become a common sense shared by financial journalists and any number of verso authors alike that the correlation of proliferating jobs in service with dwindling posts in manufacturing marks something of a qualitative break in the capitalist system, revealing the inadequacy of existing critical frameworks like, Marxism for explaining the ostensibly new social relations of capital. In such arguments, no surprise, performance looms large. For the Italian autonomist Paolo Virno, the fact that Marx excluded immaterial activities from his schema of the capitalist production process, focusing instead only on work that yielded material products, makes, so Virno argues, makes Marx's value theory all but obsolete in a post-Fordist society in which, as Virno has written on multiple occasions, all wage labor today has something in common with the performing artist. As I have argued elsewhere, and I imagine Jazz and Martin are tired of hearing me repeat this, Virno's critique of Marx, like those from many other autonomous and post-Marxists, mistakes Karl Marx for Adam Smith. Marx was well aware that service could be organized along capitalist lines. After all, Marx regularly went to the theater. At various moments in his critique of political economy, Marx described theater as a place where entrepreneurs sell the performance work of actors to audiences in the hopes of securing a profit. Marx typically turns to the theater when he wants to disprove the assumption widely held in classical political economy that service is exceptional to capitalist production. For Marx, whether a worker produces surplus value for a capitalist depends entirely on both the social relations at play and whether their labor is invested with capital. It has little to do with the materiality of the product they produce. Michael Heinrich has summarized Marx's critique of Adam Smith using terms that are immediately relevant to the argument at hand. Quote, and this is Heinrich. In a capitalist theater, the actors are therefore just as much productive laborers as steel workers who work in a capitalist steel mill. As I noted earlier, this does not mean that every single theater is organized along capitalist lines. What matters here is that Marx recognized the potential for a theater to be organized along capitalist lines when it would seem to serve the interests of capitalists. And Marx uses this fundamental fact about theatrical production to clarify the always contingent economic relation of service to capital. Now, let me just re-emphasize this claim, just to make sure you all kind of know what I'm going on about. A lot has been said about the resemblance of performance and service work by all manner of scholars, researchers, etc. But a really simple point that Marx himself emphasized has gone largely ignored. And it is this: theater, like most service work, can be organized along capitalist lines, but this only tends to happen when it seems to suit the interests of capital. For Marx, the fact that services today are increasingly organized along capitalist lines is not evidence that we have entered a completely new phase of capitalism, let alone a kind of post-capitalism. This was written before COVID-19, by the way. Like theater, service work under capitalism has always been potentially and contingently subject to the law of value. Now, what everyone I'm sure has been waiting for: what has become of theater under deindustrialization, as the world of work supposedly has come to resemble performance? Simply stated, theater's economic relation to capital remains as contingent today as it ever has been. But in terms of its aesthetics, theater has in fact undergone a significant transformation over at least the past 50 years. What defines theater in the age of deindustrialization is not so much its dematerialization as its de-dramatization. Instead of turning away from producing objects, as happened in other artistic fields, theater has turned away increasingly from the production of dramatic texts. Theater's de-dramatization could in fact be described as a kind of rematerialization in the theater, insofar as the shift from gearing the theatrical apparatus to serve the needs of plot-driven dialogic exchange, that is my definition of drama. This shift away from drama and theater has allowed and sometimes forced artists like Robert Wilson or the Worcester Group to foreground theater's materiality, from its lighting rigs and sound systems to its physical spaces. In the 21st century's most debated and cited theater monograph, Hans Thies Lehmann describes this sea change in theatrical form as post-dramatic theater. Post-dramatic theater, as in post-drama, not post-traumatic. This is not to say that drama no longer exists, just as painting and sculpture still exist. Moreover, dramatic form remains culturally dominant, especially in television and film. Most post-dramatic theater artists themselves engage with the weight of drama's residue. Directors like Katie Mitchell or Akira Takayama dismantle classics by Strindberg and Wagner, while writers like Elfriede Jelinek and Debbie Tucker Green grapple with the role of text in theater after drama. Among the earliest to identify this shift in theatrical form was none other than Raymond Williams. In his 1975 lecture, Drama in a Dramatized Society, Williams observed, quote, "Drama is no longer coextensive with theater. Many dramatic performances are now in film and television studios." At the time, in the 1970s, film and television were not just in the business of dramatization, they had long since proven themselves technologically better equipped than theater for telling stories using dialogue spoken by actors pretending to be other people. Again, that's my definition of drama. But rather than spell the demise of theater, Williams saw this threat as what he called a kind of theatrical opportunity, one that could free theater artists to explore what else can be done with theater. The historical explanation for theater's de-dramatization has barely budged beyond Williams's now 50-year-old insight regarding theater's competition with other media. Hans Thies Lehmann, for instance, opens his book Post-Dramatic Theater by nodding to, among others, Marshall McLuhan and the end of the Gutenberg Galaxy, describing post-dramatic form as theater's response to what Lehmann calls the spread and omnipresence of the media in everyday life since the 1970s. Completely absent in Lehmann's historical account is any reference to things like deindustrialization. Lehmann, in fact, staunchly refuses to, and these are his words, to trace the new theatrical modes of creation to sociologically determined causes and circumstances. Such attempts, Lehmann writes, normally fall short. Lehmann's refusal of economic history is extremely frustrating, but also accidentally appropriate. It suggests a certain truth about how the trajectories of theatrical form and theater's economic relation to capital have diverged over the past half century. While theater's aesthetic form theater remains as economically contingent as it ever has been. Meanwhile, what theater's consistently contingent relation to capital can tell us about capitalism has, I think, grown enormously under deindustrialization. For one, the fact that some theaters continue to be organized along capitalist lines, while others are not, attest to the persistence of values' tendency, as Marx understood it, to subsume and expel activities as capital accumulation requires. Moreover, the low wages and resistance to productivity growth that have characterized theaters for centuries should give us some sense of the kinds of dismal wage and growth rates we should expect to continue to see in the service sector in the decades to come. That is, if there are any more decades to come. And finally, theater's miserable economic history suggests that the long downturn capitalism has endured since around 1973 will not be remedied by throwing even more workers into service jobs that resemble performance. If theater can teach Marxists today what it taught Karl Marx in the 19th century, it is probably this: service, whether organized along capitalist lines or not, cannot guarantee the rate of accumulation needed to avoid crisis and collapse. And that is my talk. So I will, I believe, hand it over to Paul or Jazz.
Okay, thanks very much. Jazz, would you like to take up the baton?
Great, yeah, thank you. And thank you, Shane, for that great paper to begin with. Okay, so I want to think about the idea of character and how character corresponds to shifts in management and business discourse over the last few decades. And when we think about character and capitalism in this way, I'm thinking particularly about the way that this idea of character permeates through the way that brands and companies pitch themselves overall, but also how character is embodied through workers and employees who are increasingly expected to perform and behave in ways that align with a management strategy and ethos. I want to argue then that this kind of increasing logic of character as an organizational force within businesses has in turn driven firms towards theatrical methods in search of ways to manage their employees. So to begin with, I just want to cite a tweet that came out late last year, which appeared on the social media feed of a fairly well-established and high-end restaurant here in Britain. And the tweet read, and excuse my inability to pronounce French words here. To the customer who accidentally got given a bottle of Chateau Le Pin Pomerol 2001, which is £4,500 on our menu last night, hope you enjoyed your evening. To the member of staff who accidentally gave it away, chin up, one-off mistakes happen and we love you anyway. This tweet went viral. It has over 65,000 likes to date. And they then followed up with another another tweet responding to comments that were critiquing them for being comfortable selling such an expensive bottle of wine, despite the high levels of homelessness in the city. And so they responded to these people by saying, to the people suggesting we have no values, we've raised well over £1 million for various charities, and concluded by saying we have values. So this public exchange is quite illustrative, I think, of a number of trends in corporate communications and PR. The first is a very deliberately flippant approach taken there to the accidental serving of this extremely expensive bottle of wine, chalked up as an unimportant loss and framed as an opportunity to gift the customers with a pleasant surprise, as well as to reinforce principles around the restaurant's approach to their staff. So the employee, presumably who has already been identified, isn't chided or disciplined, but is encouraged, told chin up, and told that their employer loves them. Of course, while the tweet underscores employment relations as cloaked in this discourse of love or familial bond, the reference to one-off mistakes suggests that a repeat offender might find this love is actually conditional after all. In the follow-up tweet, the follow-up tweet is also interesting, I think. Firstly, we see the now common use of the first person, which far from being exceptional is the way that many company social media accounts are now written. Despite the huge reach of the brand, then, this register of personal familiarity and intimacy is being cultivated, attempting to give the brand a clear sense of character. The insistence that the company does have values as exhibited through their charitable work is also notable, contributing again to this sense of character very much in the moral and ethical sense. So I want to think about where this turn towards the cultivation of character comes from and what its implications are. So to begin with, I want to draw on the new spirit of capitalism, where Luc Boltanski and Yves Chiapello trace the emergence of a new management ideology characterized by a dispensation of hierarchies, the promotion of organization along the lines of networks or projects, and a restructuring of work in response to demands for both authenticity and freedom. So the authors frame these changes largely as part of capital's response to an increasing dissatisfaction of workers, particularly post-1968, who began to expect or demand that work would allow them some sense of personal fulfillment and contribution towards society. So Boltanski and Chiapello argue that management literature is one of the main sites in which the spirit of capitalism is inscribed, and so go on to compare management literature from the 1960s to the 1990s in order to chart this definitive change of approach, and they term the new style that they identify neo-management. Similarly, in his book on authenticity and the cultural politics of work, Peter Fleming also identifies this kind of turn towards the idea of authenticity in business as emerging from what he says are the attempts to, quote, solve the problem of self-alienation and cure the pathologies sustained by workers, end quote. So Fleming describes this new management style as just be yourself management and argues that managerial consultants, particularly in the United States and Britain, now increasingly use authenticity as a reference point for how we understand employee motivation and productive performance. Of course, these ideological and financial rationales for the integration of personalized, authentic concerns into the workplace also coincide with the growth of the service sector relative to manufacturing, which in turn results in more interactive jobs, or as Kathy Weeks, paraphrasing the work of C. Wright Mills, writes, putting subjectivity to work in jobs that are less about manipulating things and more about handling people and symbols. So one result of this emphasis on character and authenticity is the kind of widespread adoption of theatrical and performative elements into the workplace, and the theatrical metaphor or analogy being taken up quite widely within management literature. So to take the work of one influential management theorist as an example, Peter Drucker in 1988 famously heralded the coming of the new organization in the Harvard Business Review, arguing that organizations of the future would be based on information, new forms of management, and that the future of work would look far less like established manufacturing companies, but have more in common with the hospital, the university, or the symphony orchestra. So for Drucker, these workplaces are examples of knowledge-based organizations composed largely of specialists who, he says, direct and discipline their own performance through organized feedback from colleagues, customers, and headquarters. I think this notion of the direction and discipline of performance via feedback mechanism is a really key point. And these future employees that Drucker is thinking about can be compared to performing artists like the members of the symphony orchestra that he cites as high-grade specialists in their work. Drucker wasn't alone in making this connection. So in a survey of the rise of the theatrical metaphor within management and consumer behavior literature, Morgan, Watson, and Hemington identify several authors working in the 1980s and 90s who were also foundational to this attempt to move beyond what they call a merely anecdotal or a theoretical comparison between service work and theatre, and instead develop a, quote, comprehensive framework that portrays a service encounter as drama, end quote. They go on, for example, to cite Grove, Fisk, and Dortch, who developed a 4-point analysis of the theatrical components that go into service context. The first of these they identify is, of course, the actor, or the service workers whose behaviors and presence help to determine the service. The second is the audience, or the consumer, who are the service recipients. Thirdly, the setting and physical environment in which these encounters occur. And finally, performance or the service enactment itself. So this theatrical framework, they argued, collectively captures the essential dimensions and design of most service encounters, combining and articulating them into a single entity. What we've ended up then with is a theatrical framework which is applied within management literature, culminating in what is being called the strategic use of the theatrical metaphor, often found in more well-known works such as the likes of the writers Pine and Gilmore, who in their widely cited work on the experience economy draw explicitly from theories of performance and performance studies in particular, and for whom drama can be understood as the strategy of the company or the business. So they write, this new economy also demands new models of work. At every level in any company, workers need to understand that in the experience economy, every business is a stage, and therefore work is theatre. So this is a reimagining of the workplace and the business as itself a dramatic production, which leads, of course, to important consequences for how the characters within that production are conceived of, managed, and strategically deployed. So why, beyond the points about the structure of creative organizations that Drucker highlights, is theatre a site that's turned to in these examples? What does the dramatic analogy or the theatrical metaphor have to offer? Why does it find itself in increasing circulation in the 1980s and 90s in this management literature? So we can think of this theatrical turn in the literature as the logical result of the need for the introduction of authenticity and character into capitalist production. If, as I would argue, we can think about actors and the theatre industry as an archetypal site for this kind of project-based, emotional and affective performative labour, we can see that it's a space which also offers the most developed and well-tested means for the development of emotional management skills. It's a natural site of comparison. But theatre is also, I would argue, a key site in the reproduction of cultural and social ideas of authenticity and character itself. In particular, if we consider the emergence of psychological realism in the late 19th and early 20th century, we can see how this played an important role in cementing notions of emotional interiority, codifying what constituted appropriate, authentic emotional displays and expression. With the rise of this psychological realism and its dramatic characters, theatre became a central space in which the creation and management of character was being developed. So as a result of the increased emphasis on authenticity and emotional management within the workplace from the late 1960s onwards, businesses necessarily began to turn towards the theatrical sphere for inspiration, for tools and assistance in how to shape and manage the character and performances of the workplace and its workers. So The theatricalization of management that we've seen in the last few decades then is not just a cultural trend, but is a result of imperatives that are driven by these kind of broader changes to work that we've seen. For businesses that adopt this approach, and there are many, the character demanded of employees becomes defined by the overarching dramaturgical model of the firm, which in turn takes on its own character, as we've seen from the tweets that I outlined at the beginning of this paper. Of course, while these accounts of how the theatrical metaphor has advanced in business literature pay really detailed attention to this kind of vocabulary and the adoption of this vocabulary, they pay much less attention to the implications that this actually has for employees and that this has on the ground level. Yet we know that this trend has real impact on management practices and on the day-to-day way that workers then experience these jobs. So as Sarah Sadler has noted in a recent article, theatre-based corporate training has now become an international management trend, with companies employing theatrical methods and bringing them into their training and workplace management. So with this in mind, the gaps in the account of the theatrical framework become quite apparent. Often, for example, while the need for a convincing and authentic performance from staff is discussed, these are framed as just another component within the wider personality of the business, as though staffing requirements can be met purely through careful selection and training and recruitment, and as if employers can exert complete control and design over their staff, which of course is far from the complete picture. In the corporate framing, the management of human emotional labor power is treated no differently from designing the scenography of an environment, and is also, of course, rarely critical of the effects on workers who are asked to perform these roles, or the broader social implications that this shift might result in. These questions have been taken up instead by people working in critical fields and also by sociologists, including Jason Hughes, who argues that the shift towards emotional intelligence can be understood as constituting a reinvention and redefinition of character, a version which attends to the short-termism and moral ambiguity of the post-Fordist flexible workplace, and which marks a continuation of processes in which the control strategies pursued in contemporary work organizations have come increasingly to involve the colonization of workers' affects and subjectivities. But of course, as many examples show, employees working in contexts where they have to perform in this manner continue to find ways of signaling resistance, whether it be through the subversion of their interactions with customers or management, by carving out time to form closer bonds with colleagues, or through more organized forms of resistance and solidarity. So I've argued in this paper that character has become somewhat of an organizing logic for companies that are operating in a newly emergent experiential and emotionally driven economy, and that this focus on authentic character within the workplace has had resultant effects on the constitution of character more broadly for workers. I'd add that the instrumentalization of authenticity in the workplace has ramifications for those processes. So, as Fleming has argued, insisting on more and more of the employee's identity being brought into the workplace has implications for the process of subjectification, and also moves that process back into the sphere of work after a period in which it may have been argued that it began to be located elsewhere, for instance, in the family, the neighborhood, etc. So in contrast then to accounts of the changing nature of work, which suggest that the increasing spread of short-term or project-based work has led to a disassociation with the workplace or a lack of identity, Fleming's argument would suggest the opposite, that the increasing demand to bring the self to work and for character to become central to the labor process results in work once again becoming a site of identity formation. As a result, we can see a tension between businesses who are increasingly reliant on these resources of character and authenticity in the workplace, while explicitly positioning that authenticity as something that exists outside of the workplace in the practices of lifestyle, consumer habits, sexuality, ethnicity, culture, etc. So the same processes of accumulation and value production, which rely on these markers to provide the stamp of authenticity that they need, are the same processes that are continually denied that continually deny and flatten the potential for those identities to really exist outside of the productive sphere. So this tension offers the potential for, if not organized resistance at the workplace level, then at a minimum, the deepening of these contributions. And I will pass on now to Martin.
Okay, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am going to talk for a bit about Backstage Labor. I want to start then with like a moment of theatre with which to establish some principles. The play is Richard Bean's farcical comedy Young Marx at the newly opened Bridge Theatre in 2017. It is a bad play in a bad venue, but I don't want to dedicate any time here to talking about either the script or the building. This production had a large revolving stage, a giant turntable, which allowed different sides of the scenery to be shown to the audience at different moments to denote different locations. While the actors acted on one half, the other half would be out of view of the audience, and stagehands could prepare the next scene, allowing for very quick changes. And in fact, at one point during the run, performances had to be cancelled after a power surge caused the stage mechanism to fail, a moment of real life symbolism which led to many extremely funny jokes about how the show's fundamentally unrevolutionary nature. So, stage management teams conventionally wear plain black during performances to create a kind of pseudo-invisibility. But for the sake of those few moments when they did pass in front of the audience, the crew for this performance were costumed in keeping with the story's 19th century setting. As such, they wore the rugged shirt sleeves and flat caps of Victorian factory workers, or at least of what we all imagine Victorian factory workers to have looked like. I saw this show from the cheap seats, which were high up and side on to the stage, and from here it was possible to see behind the main scenery into the far side of the revolve, a view not granted to those who paid more to see the show face on. This meant that I got the occasional sight of the stage crew moving around across the concealed areas, dressed for heavy manual labour, but tiptoeing around, silently placing set and props ready for the next scene without bringing themselves to the audience's attention. And that's the image with which I want to start this paper, an unintended glimpse at a group of workers costumed to look like authentic proletarians, diligently labouring out of sight. This is how I want to talk about theatre. And when I'm talking about theatre in this paper, I am talking about the kind of theatre you probably imagine when you hear the word theatre, especially if you are not a scholar of theatre studies. We might say that this is traditional theatre or bourgeois theatre or the theatre of modernity. It has some positively identifiable characteristics. It features an end-on proscenium stage and also has a backstage, concealed wings, a fly tower and trapdoors. That is to say, the space in which theatrical spectacle is produced extends in all directions beyond what the audience can see. The auditorium is dressed with red velvet and gold decor, identifying it as a piece of luxury consumption, firmly situated in the capitalist leisure economy. The Marxist theatre scholar Nicholas Rideout has influentially reduced the entire edifice of the theatre of bourgeois modernity to an embarrassingly demystified schema. He writes, "It is the theatre in which one group of people spend leisure time sitting in the dark to watch others spend their working time under lights, pretending to be other people." At this stage, I want to emphasize a point made by Augusto Corriere, that this traditional theatre of bourgeois European modernity continues to underpin not only modern theatre practice, which often seeks to disavow it, but also our shared conceptions of theatre. So however far away from red and gold current theatre practitioners may strive to get, some key principles of what theatre is are directly derived from this theatre of modernity. And I say this because in a bit I'm going to talk about some Victorian stagecraft, and I don't want it to be dismissed as merely a historical curiosity. And I also say this because, like Jazz and Shane, I'm very much interested in how theatre functions as both a metaphor and an exemplar for certain processes within the capitalist economy and bourgeois society. And so the abstract model, the ideal of theatre, serves a powerful role, even if every real world instance of theatrical production can be shown to deviate from it. So I am talking about the abstract ideal of the bourgeois theatre of European modernity, hereafter to be referred to as theatre. This theatre, Rideout suggests, is shaped by the organised and pervasive division between work and leisure. A Marxist account of theatre has a lot to say about the constitution of leisure as a discrete sphere of human experience in capitalist society, which might, for example, draw on Theodor Adorno's critique of free time. But my focus here is on how theatre can help us in thinking about the other side of this division, how labour is partitioned off and made to appear as though separate from other areas of life. Famously, Marx distinguishes himself from the bourgeois economists who went before him by inviting the reader to leave the noisy sphere of the market in which commodities circulate and where, he says, everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone, and instead to journey into the hidden abode of production, on whose thresholds there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business. The separation of production into a sphere of private activity beyond public awareness is a foundational principle of bourgeois society, and the image of the barred factory gate epitomizes this dynamic. And yet there is another image which we tend to turn to more regularly to describe this concept, because at some point in their lives, every single person on this call has used the phrase behind the scenes to refer to productive activity which is concealed, especially from those who benefit from it. We have already heard about the analogy between performance work and service work, and I will briefly return to that myself later on, but my main focus here is how theatrical labour, and backstage labour in particular, is made analogous to productive industrial work. For one of performance studies' most influential theorists, Richard Schechner, the sealed-off factory provides a model for understanding the theatre of modernity itself. That there is a distinct separation between the spaces occupied by the patrons and the workers, even down to them entering the building through different doors, is for him, quoting, a version of the industrial practice of separating the factory where goods are produced from the store where they are sold. Another performance theorist, Alice Rayner, says of Marx's inquiry into the hidden abode that he looked backstage, so to speak, to bring workers on stage. That the theatre and the factory can be yoked into such a pregnant analogy is indicative of their shared underlying logic, the logic of modernity. The conception of modernity I'm using here, which finds an apt expression in the formal structure of the bourgeois theatre, is closely correlated with that described by Timothy Mitchell. For Mitchell, one of the central constituting processes of capitalist modernity is what he terms representation. He describes this as forms of social practice that set up what seems an absolute distinction between image and reality. In the theatre, this distinction between image and reality maps very neatly onto the distinction between the spectacle on stage and the labour backstage, between what the audience is supposed to see and what they're not. As Rayner argues, one of the definitive features of the theatre of modernity is not only that it puts things on display, but that it also withholds things from view. This provokes the conviction, Rayner writes, that what is conventionally hidden and then revealed is more true and real than any representation. Technicians and stage crew, because they necessarily exist outside the frame of theatrical representation, therefore register for audiences as a glimpse of the real behind the illusion. Mitchell and Rayner enact a similar approach in which the idea of theatre serves as a metaphor for the logic of representation. And I can also flag up here that Mitchell and Rayner, along with Rideout, who I just quoted, and a few other scholars, do a move similar to Jacques Derrida, in which the logic of theatrical representation serves as a conceptual model for the dual character of the commodity. And I'm not going to go into that, but that's like another side of this use of metaphor. So this is why I think it was interesting to have stagehands dressed as factory workers at the Bridge Theatre in 2017. It unintentionally gave theatrical representation to this metaphor. The invocation of the 19th century industrial proletariat in this way continues a kind of metaphorical discourse that many 19th century theatre critics themselves participated in. For example, what I saw in that theatre, actors performing in front of the scenery and stagehands working behind it, is the central image of a satirical article which was anonymously published in Belgravia magazine in 1867. The author treats the bourgeois society in which he operates as a world riven with repression, concealment, and hypocrisy, identifying shams and makeshifts everywhere. In one example, he narrates at length the story of an awkward social interaction in which he and his wife arrived at the house of a friend before their hosts or the household staff were ready to receive them. In the retelling, the visitors are referred to as the audience, and the maid who greets them at the door is a hapless actress attempting to play for time. From the door, he recalls, he could hear the din and clash of moving trays, rustling dresses and hurrying footsteps. The scene was not set. Here, in contrast with the previous papers, it is stage management and not performance, which is equated with service work. And it's worth pausing on this for a moment. The theatre scholar Eleanor Skimmin identifies the theatre as the twin of the white bourgeois home. She writes, "The invisible stagehands keeping the illusion on stage intact, their behind-the-scenes labour of ferrying and arranging the furniture of the sitting room set, the always discreet presence of the usher guiding spectators to their seat, appear as the twins of the domestic servant. Like the theatre, with its backstage and its wings, the architecture of bourgeois homes was premised on the concealment of labour. Dedicated corridors and stairways allowed the servants to keep out of sight and achieve an unobtrusive quasi-invisibility. A widely cited synecdoche for this arrangement was the green baize door, a sound-insulated portal which bracketed off the workers' portion of the house and came to represent the division between the two distinct worlds, which finds its own twin in Bram Stoker's description of a theatre curtain as that acre of green baize which hid all the delightful mysteries of the stage. Before theatre curtains were red, they were green. Nostalgia for this historical moment of repressed and hidden labour presumably explains the name of Green Baize Door Limited, a 21st century company which prides itself on staffing the world's most discerning homes. So in his own way, the Belgravia author presents a similar diagnosis of bourgeois society as Timothy Mitchell's. He sees everywhere a disjuncture between appearance and the reality it masks, and he frames this as a proliferation of theatrical scenes throughout daily life. His polemic encompasses all manner of social interactions, the bedside manner of doctors, the silver tongues of lawyers, the bombast of politicians, as well as architectural facades, the repression of emotion, and social taboos around domestic violence. At every turn, he finds theatrical scenes thrown up to mask the true operations of society. The oddness of the article is that the anonymous author does not view any of this as a problem. In fact, while the capacity for artifice and deception are often held against theatre, here they are wryly made positive. Without the quasi-theatrical moments of distraction and deception, those difficulties, domestic, social, or political, that exist beneath the surface of society would be brought to prominence. And he goes on to write, "These are the things that make the great drama go smoothly. Take them away, what should we behold? Nothing but unseemly sights and actions, ghastly spectacles, framework of incompleted scenery, gas pipes, shirt-sleeved and white-capped workmen. In this account, all the world has a backstage, and the men and women are not all merely players. Some, nearer still, are stagehands. They labour out of sight to sustain the many roles of the so-called great drama, their exits and their entrances concealed by scenery. To endow the image of the theatre labourer with such specific significance is telling. All society, the image suggests, has, once the external dressing is stripped away, a common irreducible core, human work. The shirt-sleeved and white-capped workman, in one sense, stands in for all productive labour. He could just as well be a worker in any of the factories or mills on which the revolutionised industry of 19th century Britain was built. Even other waged workers, such as the domestic staff, can have their activity expressed in terms of the stagehand. The theatrical metaphor allows the author to gesture towards something very like abstract labour. So, in order for the products of labour to be economically exchangeable with one another, the labour itself must be reduced to a common abstraction. Marx refers to this as the homogeneous mass of human labour power, not any specific kind of concrete labour, but labour in the abstract. But in gesturing towards this equalising abstraction, the metaphor also disguises the heterogeneity of the working class. The image of the stagehand as an iconic representative of abstract labour denies, among other things, a global empire of resource extraction and slavery, as well as an economy of domestic work. The fact that work is undertaken out of sight allows for an extremely narrow and limited conception of what work is and who does it. Allowing the stagehand to stand in for all workers is the same move that was made in the 2017 production of Young Marx at the British Theatre. That show's own stagehands dressed as Victorian factory workers. The play itself had no concern with industrial production. The scenes were mostly set in Marx's house. And yet, because scenery needed to be moved during the show, the audience was going to have to look at some undisguised physical exertion. So it seemed obvious and natural to dress up the stage workers as authentic proletarians. The semiotics of this costume, however, that a flat cap and shirt sleeves successfully denote the working class, even in the year 2017, needs to be examined. Why does this white male factory worker get to stand in for the working class? Asad Haider and Salah Mohandesi tackle this question in a Viewpoint article. They locate changing conceptions of the working class in the history of left-wing strategy, starting in the 1830s, when the socialist project shifted from being imagined as a top-down bourgeois technocratic benevolence to being understood as a struggle in which the working class was an independent agent of its own interests. This conception took hold, and from the 1860s, the socialist political movement required, in their words, that a heterogeneous multitude must compose itself into a single subject. According to their characterization, 19th century social democracy resolved this with three fundamental principles, which are, first, that one sector of the working multitude metonymically stood in for all the rest. Second, the interests of this particular figure took priority over all others. And third, socialists privileged the shop floor where these factory workers worked as the primary terrain of class formation. Other forms of production, such as sharecropping and slavery, not to mention domestic and communal reproduction, were all discursively subsumed behind wage labour, which was elevated to the defining principle not only of the extraction of surplus value, but of the totality of working class struggle. This is an important historical insight for denaturalizing the image of what a worker looks like, but I want to push further and suggest that the elevation of the white male factory worker to the status of avatar for the proletariat cannot fully be explained as a failed strategy or narrow conception by left-wing movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. Though it was surely exacerbated by these compromised and compromising formations, it seems to emerge directly from and owe its conditions of possibility to the abstraction of labour, which is inherent in commodity exchange. This is what I take Dipesh Chakrabarty to mean when he writes that the worker is an abstract and collective subject by its very constitution. That one labourer can be imagined to stand in for all labourers discursively is directly related to the fact that in commodity production this takes place for real. Once their labour has been fixed in an alienable product, the individual identities of the workers and their conditions of work become moot. So through this theatre metaphor, we have stumbled sideways into questions of authenticity. Who is an authentic worker, and so on. And this brings us back to the earlier points from Alice Rayner about the real and how things signify as real. It is because a significant part of theatre's activity is conducted out of the audience's view that what takes place on stage in plain sight comes to be regarded with suspicion as something less than real. Rayner writes, "The stagehands who operate the running of a production seem to be the antidote to such dubiousness. Practical, necessary, and concrete, their work, by comparison, has a kind of worldly reality. They seem firmly entrenched in the reality which is distinguished from the pretenses of bourgeois theatre's illusions." So in the context of theatre's illusions, backstage workers come to signify as concretely real. And this is a point that Jacques Rancière makes more generally, that the working class comes to be associated with authenticness. Rancière does not explicitly cite Marx's hidden abode passage, but echoes it when he talks about philosophers seeking out what he terms the hidden truth of the workshop. In the development of philosophy from Plato to Marx, Rancière observes that, quoting here, "the class once judged to be too ignoble to raise its eyes to heaven has come to be endowed with the supreme nobility of truth incarnate." Rancière's critique is similar to Rayner's, that workers become objectified and even fetishized as a source of empirical knowledge. For Rancière, the problem with all this is that to position workers as incarnate truth requires them to remain mute, stripping them of their agency, and finding them to be inauthentic when they do attempt to express political will or take political action. To conclude then, the recurrent popularity of theatre as a metaphor demonstrates that the theatre provides the terms for bourgeois society to describe itself. It provides a venue to consider the concealment of labour, the ideological preoccupation with the real, and the politics of representation. Backstage workers provide the perfect analogy for labourers more generally, precisely because they are ontologically required to remain out of sight. The metaphorical identification of theatre workers with the broader working class concedes the centrality of unseen labour to capitalist society, but does so at the expense of reinscribing its invisibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thanks to all three of you for excellent papers. I have some questions for you. So what I'm going to do, I think, is start with a question each that have been posed by our audience, and then we'll move the discussion on. So I think the first question is for Shane, and that question is, your talk focuses on theatre's relation to industrial capitalism specifically. Could you explain on how theatre's relationship to capital might also correspond to rentier forms of capital, such as real estate? That's from Faisal. Then we have one from Maeve, and Maeve asks Jazz, I've come across so many people in service who are also in theatre. Is there something in the fact that so many in theatre depend on other employment and that they also perform in such jobs too? And then we have one for Martin, although in a sense it relates to all, from Rhys Jones. And Rhys asks, it'd be great to get details of the article that Martin is talking about in discussing conceptions of the working class. Rhys also notes he'd like to see or access the bibliographies for all of your talks. So perhaps you could start between yourselves with those. Shane?
Sure, thanks so much. That is a great question from Faisal. So I guess it's first important to clarify that I'm not talking about like industrial capitalism. I'm trying to focus on the capitalist production process, specifically, and kind of it's in the form of its ideal average. I think that's really important just to emphasize. I'm not just focusing on industrial because I think industrial comes to have a lot of baggage and carry with it a lot of assumptions. So with regards to rent, it's because I'm focusing so much on the capitalist production process and trying to think about like what we can learn about it and what gets excluded from it and when and under what circumstances. Rent doesn't necessarily come as much into play as it probably should at this moment in terms of like the Trinity formula that Marx sketches out. I'm focusing mostly on like labor and capital. But one can imagine, as Faisal notes, that like, you know, we can think a lot about not just theater as a metaphor and a model, but also actually the actual stake that it has in a capitalist economy in terms of real estate. I think that's really legitimate. My colleague Michael McKinney has written a lot about that. So I'd suggest Faisal, if he's interested in that, to check out work by my colleague Michael McKinney. And I think that in addition to that, one thing that actually Martin and I have been working on, one of the keywords on the commodity recently. And one thing that came up for me as I was working on that is I started talking about like, okay, so the commodity that's get produced in theater, that could be like a performance, obviously, it can also be like a play text. It could be various kinds of merchandise, like I kind of thought through this, it could be like a script. It could be a DVD of a performance, and then I was like, wait, no, DVDs of performances probably aren't really sold in the theater. I haven't been to the theater like a year, but like DVDs of theater aren't really sold anymore, they're streamed. And so that brings up a whole nother kind of rentier frontier, I would say, that I think is really, really interesting to consider. I think I'll hold off. I think that's all I'll say at this moment. So yeah, I don't know if Martin or Jazz have anything to add to that or want to take on their questions.
I'm happy to take Maeve's question. Thank you for that really interesting question, Maeve. So yeah, I think it tells us quite a lot, both about kind of what's happening in those kind of service areas that people are working in as their second jobs, and then also, I guess, about the kind of training that's going on, or what the future might be for those aspiring actors themselves. I think it's quite telling that those skills are in such high demand in other industries or other sections of the economy, and that actually those who are trained in professional performance kind of find other avenues to use that training in other jobs, which has become so prevalent. And that tells us a bit about how in demand those kind of emotional and performative skills have become, which I guess kind of ties to the argument that I was making in my paper about the kind of need to cultivate character. And actually, if you come with a skill set where you are equipped to kind of perform these authentic characters, you're pretty well placed for various other jobs in today's economy. But I also think it's interesting for two other reasons, I guess, in terms of what happens to the future of training then. We've seen lots of shifts in actor training in Britain specifically, but I would assume probably more broadly and internationally over the past 10 to 20 years. Obviously, it's a completely oversubscribed industry, and there are already huge issues with kind of graduates from these programs finding work. But we're also seeing a shift towards training kind of being broken down into smaller components, which is a broader shift in higher education, but also happens within the conservatoire and within practical actor training, and a kind of retooling of actor training to service the needs of sectors of the economy where these skills might be needed. So at the moment, that's still being framed around, you know, TV and film and radio work as opposed to maybe theatre work. But we may well start to see it shift in a more explicitly commercially driven direction. And then I guess the final thing that comes to mind is kind of how strong the discourse of love is, and how much that kind of drives people's willingness to put up with quite appalling conditions and pay, to the extent that they often have to make, you know, 90% of their income from other jobs, but they kind of continue within the theatre industry, I mean, on the basis that there's this kind of labor of love, as it were. And obviously in the creative industries, we know that this is really, really prominent and pronounced. And actually it can kind of stop theatrical workers or artistic or creative workers from really looking at what they do as work in itself. And that's an obstacle to kind of organizing for better conditions. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts, but Shane and Martin might also have more thoughts on that question.
And I would just add the like nature of underemployment among like actors and performers and that sort of thing is playing into kind of what Maeve is talking about. So just to reemphasize some of what you're saying. Yeah.
I would add, I don't know what you think about this, but one of the industries that benefits a lot from this is theatre itself, in the form of like front of house workers and stuff. So like every front of house worker I've ever worked with has been an aspirant actor or maybe some other role in the theatre, but there's like a huge amount of theatre benefiting from deeply discounted service work from very enthusiastic and keen people, because those are people who really want a foot in the door to get a completely different kind of work out of the employer.
Okay, we have another round of questions, so we'll go through those. This time we start with Martin, and Martin has a question from Olive. How might your considerations of the theatrical scenario relate to conceptions of history or the revolutionary process, i.e. entrance onto the stage of the protagonists of history? Then we have a question for Jazz from Cleo Suzanne. You talked a bit about how the production of character is managed in service work. Could you expand a bit on how you see it being managed in a more traditional theatre? And finally, we have a question for Shane again. So coming to everyone. And this is from Pernil. For Shane, how can we understand the category of performance in 18th and 19th century political economy. It's a recent coinage. Do we identify it simply, Shay Adam Smith, as the labour of the actor on stage? Let's start this time with Martin.
Okay, so this question is the revolutionary working class, I guess, entering onto the stage as protagonists of history. And the most obvious thing that makes me think of is Mario Tronti's Lenin in England, where exactly that scenario is described. And this is another version of someone trying to use this theatrical metaphor in this kind of way. So he talks about people rushing the stage and eventually, I think, assailing the audience, and that is kind of the assertion of the working class as agents of history. Now, I'm trying to think if I can add anything to that as a metaphor, because I guess part of my problem with this is I think metaphors are more interesting when I catch other people using them, and when I try and like come up with them myself, I know that I'm going to end up producing something which has implications I don't agree with. So maybe I will hold off on that.
Jazz, did you want to carry in?
So the question about how character is actually produced in a kind of theatrical context or in a theatrical production, I think is quite interesting, because actually, if we're talking about kind of traditional psychological realism, as I was in the paper, the organization of that is kind of along kind of Fordist or Taylorist lines, in fact, particularly when you kind of look at the kind of breakdown of the play text and how that's tackled in rehearsals. We can think very much about task management in terms of how this actually proceeds, and how it's conceptualized. If we are taking the most prominent form of actor training, for example, which would be the Stanislavskian tradition of training, that is very much based on a kind of scientific task-based management, which we can draw kind of direct parallels between that and task-based management in other sectors of the industry. Of course, that's quite interesting when we think about how this then relates to contemporary forms of work, which we often conceive of or are told represent a fundamental break with those forms of management. I guess my tentative argument might be that when it comes to emotional management and the management of character, it's not such a decisive break, and that actually some of these older forms of management, which we're told, you know, have been kind of relegated to the past in the post-Fordist era, actually persist, but more in the management of emotional, affective, and character-based labor. So, yeah, I mean, if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd really like to hear them, but that's kind of what I think at the moment.
Sure, Shane.
Great. So I imagine Martin will also want to weigh in on this, maybe just having read a lot of Martin's work. I think that he has some things to say about this, the question from panel. So yeah, I think it's really, really important to flag that, yeah, for someone like Adam Smith and also people writing right around the same time of him, they're really focusing on specific kinds of performance, like acting in Smith and others, also like singing and dancing come up. I think the big distinction between, say, Smith and Marx is the fact that Marx adds on to this understanding of specific kinds of work, the actual like firm or framework of the theater. Okay, so the organization of the theater, the division of labor, the capital investment, all of that. So he kind of tries to think about how these different kinds of labor are organized, and he calls that theater. Now, I think that there's quite a few limits to, you know, this theater and performance distinction that I play with, but I think it's nonetheless useful and hopefully clarifying. But I think one of the ways that it's most kind of, one of the ways that my distinction that I'm getting from Marx is like most kind of problematic, I think, is that it kind of lets off the hook performance art and live art, which also can be organized, maybe not as theater in a theater, but nonetheless can still be invested with capital, can still deploy wage labor, that sort of thing. And Martin, do you have anything to add to that? Not to put you on the spot.
I'm not sure that I do, except that I don't. So I think that the category of performance in political economy is not just the actor of the labour on the stage. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but I think the kind of the point of it is that the category of performance is a bigger category, which includes and kind of blurs together actors on the stage with lawyers and doctors and, you know, servants and the rest of it. So I'm not sure that 18th to 19th century political economy had any real interest in defining performance as in theatrical or entertainment performance. I think that it was only of any interest to them in as much as it was like an exemplar of other kinds of activity.
Yeah, and I think that's where Marx is really, really important for theater and performance scholars, is that he begins to lay on to the organization of these different jobs, like of a singer, of a dancer, of an actor, this like level of the theater. Marx went to the theater a lot. His wife and his daughter were theater critics. So he knew that like theater was not just acting or singing or dancing, but that it was an actual like firm, organization of capital, business, that sort of thing. And so I think that's like the really, really important distinction. So I think Panel's exactly right that this kind of general category of performance probably didn't exist for Smith. I think the really important point is the distinction between specific performancey, that's what I'd say, jobs like acting, singing, dancing, and this kind of organizational or social form of the theater that has wage labor, capital investment, division of labor, etc.
Okay, we have two questions for the panel in general. The first is from Lucy, and Lucy's wondering about the relationship between the hidden and the performative within post-industrial forms of labor, whether performing, not working, is another form of hiding or abstracting labor, and should be interested to hear your views on that. And then Joy builds on that, because Joy asks about the worker in open office plans where very little is hidden. How do metaphors of theatre and performance operate here? And that's open to any of you.
Sorry, I just need to reread Lucy's really quick. That's a really good question.
I don't know why I'm waiting for Shane to read something. I'll start answering. I think one of the points that I get from Alice Rayner, who is one of the performance scholars that I was citing throughout that, is that in the kind of the model of theatre I was using, you've got what's on display and you've got the backstage, and the backstage signifies as more real and more kind of authentic and whatever, and for that reason becomes more and more fascinating. And so this problem you have is when you can see, as I could, the stagehands kind of doing stuff on stage, I could see the real process of theatre, but then I also became more and more aware that I couldn't see what was happening just out of sight in the wings, right? So you constantly, like, as soon as something becomes visible, it ceases to really be the real, like it ceases to satisfy that desire to see behind the artifice. And I'm bringing this up because I think that in possibly both of those questions, right, where there maybe the formal kind of concealment is less possible or less visible, you end up chasing down something that is out of sight. And I think that kind of goes both ways. So performing, not working, the more that you perform that you're not working, the more that you try and perform that this is like a labor of love or whatever, the more, at least my experience of going into like cafes and places, is the more I'm trying to look behind that smile and sort of see the real feeling of the worker, right? Because that's what it is. And then similarly, I think workers in open plan offices, like there remains this kind of grain of a sense that there is something that must be concealed from the boss. So it kind of, yeah, maybe I'll leave that there and let Jazz jump in.
Yeah, I guess just to build on that point and in response to Joy's question, I mean, it makes me think of, you know, the kind of the kind of notion of company culture and how important that is. And when we think about HR departments and HR management, and how actually the kind of theatrical metaphor does persist into that realm, particularly in notion of cultivating the kind of character of a company, the collective character, and the kind of relationships between employees in that context, and how central they are to kind of the smooth functioning of an office environment. I certainly have worked in an office environment where a consultant has been brought in to get us to essentially do personality quizzes, not just for us as individual employees, but also to kind of build a personality for the company or the workplace itself. So I think we do see that kind of theatricalization carry through even into environments where there is not a public or customer facing role. And it's quite pronounced. And of course, the kind of use of theatricality, in particular theatre games and theatre training, in order to create a kind of collective, a sense of collectivity, I think is particularly where that emerges.
Yeah, to add to what Jazz was saying, that's really helpful, and to also respond to Joy's question, I think that there's a really interesting history here as well with regards to the open office plan and like landscape office plans and that sort of thing, that actually a lot of the designers of kind of, or original kind of innovators and designers of open office scenarios and that sort of thing, a lot of them were in West Germany, and they were also set designers, and really, really innovative and exciting set designers. So there's this really interesting history between kind of the reorganization of the workplace and theater in an entirely other way. I don't really know what the connection fully is, but it's come up for me quite a bit. And like, there's something there. And I look forward to what Jazz and Joy have to say about that in the future.
Okay, I have one final set of questions, and I'll take them now. The first is from Tanzel. Do you think, and it's mainly for Jazz, but all of you might want to respond, do you think there's any relationship between the liquid characteristics of capital accumulation gained in the neoliberal era? And Tanzel points out, you can think of this with the corrosion of character analysis of Richard Sennett and the jobs and security, etc., and the performance in the workplace of your analysis. What do you think? So that's the first question. The second question, and the final question, I regret, is just crept in from Sarah. And Sarah has asked, I was wondering how you think we could conceptualize different forms of work in the theatre as specifically gendered. So if each of you would like to engage with those, I think maybe Jazz, you should start this one.
Yeah, I don't know at the moment. I would have to kind of think about that a bit more, but it's a really interesting question. I think this kind of idea of obviously the corrosion of character, but also I think about in terms of theatrical literature, of course, Eleanor Fuchs' work on the death of character. So this idea that character, you know, like the kind of demise of character as being something that kind of persists in both sides of that literature is something I'm trying to think through, because I guess my argument is somewhat in opposition to that, that actually there is a kind of continuation and a resurgence of character, but it's just being remolded in a particular way. So I'm very interested in thinking about how, as you say, the liquid characteristics of capital accumulation might impact that, but I don't have a bigger answer for you right now. Maybe one of the other panelists has thoughts.
I don't necessarily, but it does call to mind this relationship that is being raised between, say, aesthetic form and economic history, and I think that's really important. And I think that it's oftentimes easy for not just theater scholars, but also Marxist cultural critics to kind of overestimate the connection and linkages between, say, aesthetic form and economic changes. And so I'm kind of worried about mapping those things onto each other too much, because I think that the history, at least the history of theater, shows that that the way in which theatrical form and the social form of capital kind of diverge, come together, diverge over time. So I think that's, for me, that's the one thing I would say doesn't necessarily speak to how this then relates to the workplace. But I think, Jazz, you've done a really good job kind of outlining that.
I can speak to the gendered nature of different forms of work in the theatre a little bit. So I was talking a lot about stagehands, and I was talking about the kind of, this analogy to a very gendered male kind of authentic proletarian idea. But that's kind of only, that's maybe misleading or incomplete, because the work of stage management more generally is incredibly feminized, I think. So in literal terms, almost every stage manager I've ever worked with has been a woman, but also in the kinds of work that are required, organization, communication, all of these kinds of things are gendered in very clear ways. And if you're working in a theatre or on a theatrical production, the gendered nature of it becomes very apparent very quickly. In particular, the sort of dynamic between designers and directors who are able to exercise creative sort of, I'm trying to think of a better word than entitlement, but maybe entitlement is the one, right? You can be as sort of creative as you want, and then a stage manager has to sort of come along and make sure that everything is actually possible and sort of do all of the fairly thankless and largely unseen work of making things actually happen. And I think that this reproduces very clearly gendered dynamics in a lot of that. So that's like one key way. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with other ones. Much shaking of heads. But okay, so then I just, maybe the other side of that is there is this real difficulty with the fact that theatre, for whatever other kind of qualities it has, requires a huge amount of physical work. And as long as like physical manual work is gendered as male, you end up with a very odd thing that like women working in the theatre do just as much heavy lifting, but it's just not noticed. I mean, this is kind of maybe a banal point, but I think that's like the other side to that gendered nature of work.
Okay. First of all, thanks very much to all three papers and all three engagements. I think one of the few problems with sessions that are online is you can't adequately show your appreciation in applause. But I thought they were incredibly good papers and came over really well, considering the medium doesn't always allow to do so. It's now 4:30 GMT, so you have an hour and a half before Partisan Counter Archive, retracing the ruptures of art and memory in the Yugoslav people's liberation struggle and beyond, is broadcast. That's our next session. Please recognize that this is run by Historical Materialism. The full program is on historicalmaterialism.org. And as the advertisement with Sebastian Budgen said at the top of this talk, please think about subscribing to the journal. Please think about subscribing to the book series. We have generous discounts on both, and they're important in continuing the work that the Historical Materialism editorial board do. Finally, thanks to both participants, or three participants, and also thanks to you for watching. We hope you gained a lot from it, and we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you very much indeed.